It had a message. Keene didn't look up. He exhaled like a man being mildly inconvenienced at the end of a long lunch. "Counselor, we're not here for discovery. We're here for arraignment. Your client stands charged with obstructing a lawful investigation." I'm not inclined to, but Riley didn't sit down. His hands were trembling, but his voice kept going. "Your Honor?" The footage shows Officer Beckett striking Mr. Allen without provocation. It contradicts the narrative in the incident report. It also shows my client standing several feet away, silent, recording, not interfering. For a second, the room felt like it leaned forward. Even the bailiff seemed to blink, just once, like the word contradicts had woken him from a dream. Beckett shifted in his seat. His jaw tightened. "That's irrelevant," snapped Ada Eliza Matz. "Your Honor? The only issue today is whether the defendant obstructed an officer in the course of his duties. The officer's use of force is not the matter before the court." Riley took one step closer to the bench. His voice grew steadier as he spoke. "Respectfully, it's entirely relevant. Because if Officer Beckett's statement is untrue, then the basis for my client's arrest collapses. The video is exculpatory. Prepare to submit it for the court's review." Silence followed. A thick, dense quiet. You could hear the ticking of a second hand on someone's wristwatch, even though the courtroom clock above Judge Keene's bench remained frozen at 11:12. Then, from the back row, the woman with the notepad finally moved. She stood up, smooth and deliberate, closing her pen and slipping it into her blazer pocket. "Your Honor," she said, her voice calm as velvet, carrying through the courtroom without strain. "My name is Jordan Dawson. I'm a federal prosecutor with the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice." A low ripple spread across the benches. Even Ada Matt's head snapped up. Jordan stepped into the aisle. Her eyes met Amira's for the first time, soft but blazing underneath. "I'm also the mother of the defendant, and I'd like to place on the record that my office has opened a preliminary inquiry into potential civil rights violations involving Officer Beckett and the department's handling of this incident, including possible obstruction of justice and witness intimidation." It was like someone dropped a glass on marble. Beckett blanched, color draining from his face. Judge Keene lowered his pen at last, finally looking up. His lips parted, but no sound came out. Ada Matz opened her mouth, closed it, then began shuffling papers with shaky fingers. Jordan Dawson held up a USB drive between two fingers. "This is a copy of the video Mr. Tran just referenced. I'd like the court to admit it into evidence." Nobody moved for several seconds. The hum of fluorescent lights seemed louder than before. Outside, the faint wail of a siren curled through the streets, fading into the distance. Then Judge Keene cleared his throat. He looked like a man who just realized the floor beneath him wasn't as solid as he thought. "Bailiff, collect the drive." Glanced at Riley, then at Amira. His voice had lost some of its iron. "Mr. Tran, we'll review this video in chambers. This matter is adjourned until further notice." The gavel fell once. Hard. A flurry of movement exploded in the courtroom. Reporters scrambled for the doors, cell phones already dialing out. Ada Matz was on her feet, conferring in a low, urgent whisper with Beckett, whose eyes darted wildly around the room. And in the middle of it all, Amira sat perfectly still, her lips still split, blood drying darker by the minute. But now, for the first time that morning, she allowed herself to look up. She met her mother's eyes, and she smiled. It showed the moment Beckett shoved the elderly man and, more importantly, it showed Amira stepping in. Not yelling, not pushing, just holding out her arms like a barrier, child protecting someone 3 times her age. He explained all that while plugging in the flash drive. The clerk wheeled over a monitor. The judge didn't look interested. The ADA was barely paying attention, but I leaned forward. So did a few others, and then the screen flickered to life. Grainy and distant, but clear enough to show what mattered. You could feel something small stir in the room. The man in the video had a cane. He moved slowly, obviously confused, obviously frightened. Beckett's body language was tense, aggressive. He said something we couldn't hear, then shoved the old man hard in the chest. The man stumbled and Amira appeared, stepping between them, not attacking, just placing herself in the space where no one else would go. She caught him, then stood. Still, that was it. And for a moment, just one, the room held its breath. But then Judge Keene leaned back and waved a hand without even looking up. He called the footage unverified, said it lacked legal confirmation, claimed it couldn't be used. As evidence, Riley tried to argue, but the judge cut him off. Dismissed the video just like that, as if it had never been shown at all. ADA Matz gave a tiny smile, a private one, like someone reacting to an inside joke. Then she said softly, almost sweetly, that it was a nice clip, but nice footage doesn't mean anything in court. The screen went dark. The monitor was unplugged, and the courtroom swallowed that brief flicker of truth like it was nothing. It's like it never mattered. A woman behind me exhaled sharply, then went quiet. Nobody else reacted, not loudly at least. There were no protests, no outrage. Just a kind of collective disappointment that settled into the walls and floors and people's bones. That was when Officer Beckett leaned slightly toward the man seated behind him, colleague in uniform, Officer Dean Harlow, who had been silent the entire time. Arms crossed, lips pressed into a hard line. Beckett whispered something with a small shake of his head. "She won't last long." That's what I heard. And something in the way he said it made my stomach turn, because it wasn't about the trial anymore. It was about breaking her. About wearing her down until the silence she carried so carefully cracked under pressure. But Amira didn't move. She didn't react. Her gaze stayed on the empty monitor where her defense had just been erased. She didn't look at her lawyer, or the judge, or the jury. She looked at no one, and yet she wasn't alone. In the back, the same woman who'd written calmly during the earlier part of the hearing was now watching intently. Lorraine Pierce still saying nothing, still revealing nothing but her eyes. Narrowed slightly as the video was dismissed. She reached down and touched the side of her watch again. Quick, controlled gesture. Not dramatic, not accidental. It was the only movement she made, but it spoke volumes. I don't know if anyone else saw it. They were too busy watching the screen go black or watching the judge pretend none of it had weight. But I saw her. And in that quiet, deliberate gesture, I felt something shift again, not in the courtroom. Not yet. But somewhere just beneath it. Something had been marked. The law had spoken. The court had decided what mattered and what didn't. But the truth had been shown, if only briefly. And that image of a child stepping in to protect someone when no one else would was burned into more than just the pixels of a forgotten screen. It had settled somewhere deeper, and I had the feeling that Lorraine, whoever she was, hadn't just come to watch it happen. She'd come to remember who looked away. And maybe, just maybe, to make sure someone paid for it later. Just when the room had started to sink back into a tired rhythm, the door creaked open again. Officer Dean Harlow stepped in. He didn't make a sound beyond the weight of his boots. On the floor, no announcement, no rush, just a quiet presence that somehow made the air tighten. He walked toward the bench with a folded slip of paper in hand, told the clerk he was there to conduct a standard evidence check on the defendants. Personal items? No one asked why. No one questioned the timing. Judge Keene didn't even look up from the stack of papers in front of him, just nodded once, barely noticeable. Ada Matz didn't blink. She didn't need to. That kind of silence was its own permission. Harlow turned to the defense table, and Officer Beckett joined him like he'd been waiting for this moment. No one summoned him. He just moved smooth and steady, a man stepping back into a role he knew too well. Riley, seated beside Amira, reached for her backpack and held it close. His voice was calm but strained as he asked what the officers were expecting to find. Harlow didn't answer. Beckett didn't look at him. Instead, Matz responded from her seat in the flat. Detached tone of someone well-practiced in power. They're simply following standard procedure. Any complaints can be filed later.
Later.
It was always later. Beckett reached across the table, took the bag. Not aggressively. It's just confidently, as though resistance would be out of place in a room like this. He placed it down in front of them, opened it wide, and began pulling things out piece by piece. It started orderly. A few notebooks, a pencil pouch, folder. But that order unraveled quickly. Pages were opened and shaken loose. Homework sheets fluttered to the floor. A wrapped sandwich landed with a dull thud and was left there. A water bottle was opened, sniffed, and tossed aside. Harlow unzipped the smaller compartments, appending the contents without a glance. Colored pencils spilled. Photo with bent corners was flicked off the edge of the table. One officer stepped on a paper without noticing. No one said a word. Riley sat frozen, his mouth half open. Then he stood and raised his voice slightly, trying again to object. But Matz cut him off without looking up. "They're doing their job," she said, was all. Across the room, a juror shifted in his seat. A woman in the gallery looked down at her hands. Behind me, someone murmured something under their breath but didn't finish the sentence, because what was there to say? Amira had not moved. Hands were still cuffed in her lap. She watched quietly as her life was emptied onto a table and sorted like debris. When they finished, the table looked scavenged, not searched. Then, without waiting for instruction, Amira stood. She walked over to her belongings, still calm, still quiet. She bent down and picked up the sandwich first, folded it back into the foil as best she could, and placed it gently into the bag. One by one, she gathered the papers, the pens, the scattered pieces of herself. She straightened a crumpled page, slipped the photograph back into a folder. Her movements were slow but deliberate, like she was reclaiming something that wasn't meant to be touched in the first place. She didn't look at anyone. No one offered help. Not the officers, not her attorney, not the judge. And no one watching stood either. When she returned to her seat, she zipped the backpack with a hand that trembled only once, barely enough to notice. In the back row, Lorraine Pierce had not moved. She had not spoken, but her eyes, steady and unblinking, had followed every motion with quiet precision. Her notebook remained closed. Her pen rested still beside it. When Amira sat back down, Lorraine raised her wrist slightly and tapped the side of her watch. Once, then again, 2 quick, silent taps. There was no response, no reaction, just the faintest glint of reflection off the metal face. But to those who knew what to look for, the signal had been sent. The courtroom continued as if nothing had happened. Judge Keene scribbled another note. Matz crossed her legs and checked her file. Harlow and Beckett returned to their seats with blank faces. The clerk rearranged a stack of folders, and Amira sat motionless beside her half-packed bag, eyes fixed on the table in front of her. She didn't speak. She didn't cry. But something about the stillness had changed. Something had been violated that couldn't be erased with paperwork or protocol. And somewhere in that quiet, line had been drawn, not by the court, by someone else. Someone who had been waiting for this exact moment to begin. For a while, the room stayed quiet, not the good kind of quiet. The kind that feels heavy. The kind that hums just beneath your skin, like something's waiting to break. Amira hadn't moved since she repacked her bag. Her hands rested atop the folder, fingers laced together, still bound by metal cuffs. Her spine was rigid, her eyes locked on a spot beyond the clerk's desk. She barely blinked. She wasn't making eye contact with anyone. Then, in a move so casual it almost seemed mundane, she slipped her right hand into the front pocket of her backpack. Each motion was deliberate, unhurried, unconcealed, just cautious. When her hand emerged again, she held a small piece of folded paper pinched between 2 fingers. Without glancing to the side, without shifting her posture, she passed it to Riley. He stared at it, uncertain, then accepted it. He unfolded it swiftly, as if expecting a list or a question, but the page held only a handful of words penned in. Meticulous, tiny letters. "Don't act. They're watching." "I'm ready." His eyes darted over it once more, slower now. Then he looked up at her. She didn't look back. Not a flicker of recognition. She simply sat there, breathing evenly. Riley looked perplexed, maybe even slightly rattled. He shifted in his chair, cleared his throat, and glanced around the room like he was recalibrating his understanding of the scene. Then something glinted at her wrist. The watch, it had been there all along, mostly concealed beneath her sleeve. He leaned just enough to get a clearer view. It wasn't some childish smartwatch, nor anything flashy or decorative. It was a matte black band with a metal clasp, enough to appear functional, yet plain enough not to draw attention. No logos, no color accents, and there was no way that piece had come off a shelf in a suburban mall. Riley's eyes narrowed. He stared, and for a moment the hum of courtroom noise receded, eclipsed by a spark of memory, a case file, perhaps. Or fragments of a forgotten training seminar. Equipment designed for covert operatives. Civilian-looking gear embedded with specialized tech. Emergency signaling tools disguised as everyday items. Watches just like that one. AMARA still hadn't budged. Riley parted his lips to speak, then hesitated. His voice dropped to a hush. "Who's watching?" A long silence followed. Then, slowly, Amamira turned her head. It was the first time all morning she'd shifted to look at anyone. Her eyes met Riley's for the briefest instant. They held no fear, no panic, only something keener, older, kind of certainty he hadn't yet learned to comprehend. Then she turned away again. But not at random. She looked toward the gallery, toward the back row, toward the woman in the dark blazer, who had remained unmoving since the session started. For the first time since stepping into the room, Amamira locked eyes with her mother. Lorraine Pierce met her gaze in return. There was no nod, no coded gesture. No expression flickering across either face, only a fleeting connection, electric and quiet, like static snapping between two wires. Then Amamira faced forward again, her expression a blank mask. But the moment it happened, and everyone who noticed it understood, it meant something. Riley didn't speak again. He didn't reopen the note, tucked it into his jacket pocket, and sat in silence like a man abruptly realizing he'd stumbled into a narrative far bigger than he'd anticipated, and I felt a current slip beneath my skin. It was as though the air itself wasn't merely observing Amamira Dawson anymore, it was holding its breath. Because for the first time since entering that courtroom, Amamira Dawson was no longer on her own. And whatever lay ahead wasn't waiting much longer. For a long stretch, Amamira remained still. The courtroom slowly settled into the taut hush that had hung over everything since the hearing began. Pages rustled faintly. Someone in the gallery coughed. Clerk's pen clicked in the distance. Nothing loud. Nothing significant. Then Beckett leaned closer. He didn't speak loudly. His lips barely moved, but his words carried just far enough for Amamira to catch and for me to catch the edge of them too. "No one's here for you. Not even your mother." The words weren't a threat. They were a dismissal, a declaration of triumph before the battle had even ended. Amamira didn't blink. She didn't turn toward him. She merely sat there, motionless. But something shifted. In the atmosphere, heralded by a chair, at first, it was only a faint scrape, polished wooden legs sliding across tile. Yet in the hush, it rang out like an alarm. One single chair pushed back in the far rear of the courtroom. It belonged to a woman who, until that instant, hadn't spoken, hadn't moved, hadn't betrayed any reaction since the proceedings began. Lorraine. Pierce rose, slow and measured, not in anger, not in panic, but with a deliberate calm that made the entire back row swivel toward her even before she'd taken a single step. She advanced down the aisle as though she possessed endless time. One step, then another. No hurry, no haste, just the steady gait of someone who knew precisely where she was headed and exactly what she planned to do. People craned their necks. Some leaning forward, others holding their breath. Still, no one uttered a word until she reached the center of the courtroom. Judge Keene lifted his eyes for the first time in minutes. He squinted slightly, confusion giving way to concern. "Ma'am, please return to your seat." "Yeah," he tried to project. Authority. But there was a tremor in his voice, a subtle fracture revealing how deeply her presence had already unnerved him. Lorraine didn't stop walking. She stepped fully into the open space between benches and the bar. Her hands rose slowly. Dipping into the inner pocket of her jacket, a flicker of apprehension swept through several faces in the room. Even Beckett's shoulders stiffened. Then Lorraine drew out a small black case. It snapped open in her hand. And that was the instant the courtroom's hush shifted from tense silence to electrified anticipation. Inside the case glimmered a federal badge, not local, not state, but embossed, sealed, and utterly authentic. Lorraine lifted her voice for the first time. It wasn't loud, but it was sure and unwavering. Agent Lorraine Pierce, Central Intelligence Agency, Division of Internal Oversight. The words fell like stones into still water. They didn't echo. They didn't need to. Simply arrive. Everything else in the room ceased to exist. The judge said nothing. Matz dropped her pen. The clerk froze mid-motion, turning a page. Someone in the gallery let out a gasp that came too loudly, then clapped a hand over their mouth as though afraid of having spoken out of turn. Beckett remained frozen. So did Hala and Amamira still. Seated at the defense table, still bound by her cuffs, gazed forward unflinchingly as if none of this surprised her. As if she'd known all along this moment was inevitable, Lorraine stood there, badge displayed calmly. No dramatic monologue, no raised voice. Just an undeniable, unwavering presence. I remember the sensation in my chest, something loosening and constricting all at once. Like a thread pulled taut for too long, finally snapping free. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was weighty, brimming, with the realization that everything people thought they were witnessing had just rewritten itself mid-sentence. Judge Keene parted his lips to speak, then closed them again. His fingers tapped once, twice, against the bench's edge, then stilled. Lorraine said nothing further. She didn't have to. Her mere presence had spoken volumes. And in that stillness, in that suspended breath of a moment, something finally broke, quietly but irrevocably. Lorraine Pierce didn't need to raise her voice. She opened the folder in her hand and spoke in a tone as measured as someone reciting a ledger of long overdue debts 4 years ago. Officer Travis Beckett used force against a 14-year-old boy during a routine stop in the Kingsbury district. The boy suffered a dislocated shoulder. He was unarmed. No arrest followed. A complaint was filed. Charges were dismissed. The case marked closed, but the file remains. She turned a page, cool and precise. 3 years ago, Officer Dean Harlow was implicated in the removal of seized narcotics from an evidence locker. Surveillance footage vanished. Chain of custody flagged. Internal Affairs recommended review. Ada Eliza Matz declined prosecution citing lack of corroboration. Another page turned. Last year, a civilian minor female, black, age 15 was listed as a key witness in a local abuse case involving both Beckett and Harlow. The minor withdrew her statement after repeated contact with the officers. Her parents filed a formal grievance. Judge Roland Keene ruled the claim inadmissible. Case was dismissed before hearing. Lorraine closed the file with a quiet but final gesture. All 3 incidents were scheduled for judicial review in this courthouse. All 3 were denied the chance to be heard. Her voice remained firm, unwavering. It didn't rise. It simply landed where it was meant to. Lorraine gazed toward the bench, obstructed by the judge's chamber, silenced by the prosecutor's authority. Mather's voice broke slightly when he spoke. This isn't relevant to the matter. Lorraine didn't turn her head, she answered without hesitation. Covering up crimes is always relevant. That was the instant the entire courtroom shifted. Not with shouting, but with breath. The kind of stillness that falls when people sense something far bigger than the case at hand is slowly being revealed. Deliberate and steady. Lorraine stepped forward and set a second document on the clerk's desk. Its seal shimmered faintly beneath the courtroom lights. Federal orders issued at 6:28 that morning. Authorization for immediate detainment. Signed by Oversight and Internal Bureau Review. The judge didn't move. Then the side door swung open. 2 men in dark suits entered. No announcements, no dramatic gestures, just calm. Precise movements that made the entire room sit up a little straighter. One man turned toward Beckett. The other moved toward Lur. Beckett stood abruptly, his chair screeching against the floor. His hands hovered uncertainly, his eyes flicking to the judge for guidance. But Keene offered none. Harlow half rose from his seat, his mouth tightening as though preparing a protest. The agent behind him moved first. His hand seized Harlow's wrist, a swift twist, twisted, the metallic snap of handcuffs echoed in the room. Gasps spread through the gallery. Someone whispered, "Oh my God!" Another man covered his mouth, murmuring under his breath. Juror leaned forward, momentarily forgetting to disguise his curiosity. A woman 2 rows behind me wiped her eyes and stared ahead, frozen, as though watching a scene from a story she already knew by heart. Mathers said nothing. The judge's hand hovered above the gavel, as if he just remembered it was there, but now wasn't sure how to use it. Lorraine didn't glance at the officers. She fixed her eyes on Keene, and he looked back. There was something fractured, in his expression, not fully broken, but splintering. A man realizing the courtroom no longer belonged to him. The agents guided Beckett and Harlow through the aisle. No one tried to intervene. Not the prosecutor, not the bailiff, not even the judge. The handcuffs gleamed beneath the courtroom lights, shining like a symbol of reckoning. When the men were gone, Lorraine turned back toward her daughter, Amamira. Didn't smile. She didn't nod. But her eyes found Lorraine's. And for an instant, something silent passed between them. It's not triumph, not revenge, but clarity. The courtroom was no longer staring at Amamira as a problem. They were watching her as a mirror, and justice quiet, deliberate, and long delayed had finally found its voice. For several long seconds, the courtroom held its breath. The cuffs were gone, but the silence remained. It wasn't heavy like before, nor suffocating. Instead, it felt like something steady bracing itself before an inevitable shift. Riley cast a glance toward the judge, then toward the monitor. When he spoke, his voice carried weight without needing volume. "Your Honor, I request that the video previously dismissed be submitted again for the court to review. It has now been verified and certified by federal authority." Judge Keene remained frozen. His fingers twitched against the arm of his chair. He didn't say yes, he didn't say no, but he didn't stop it either. Riley turned to the clerk, and the screen flickered to life. This time, it wasn't a grainy clip or informal footage. In the top corner, a crisp watermark glowed in white. Below it, a digital timestamp ticked forward, and in between, the truth played out once more. An elderly black man stumbled into the frame. He moved slowly, bewildered. His hands were raised. His voice was faint, but he posed no threat. Beckett stepped forward, shoulders squared, and shoved him hard in the chest. The older man staggered backward, and then, without hesitation, Amamira entered the frame. She didn't yell, she didn't push, she didn't make a single loud gesture. She simply placed herself between the officer and the man, arms outstretched, body unmoving, a human shield. A child standing where no adult would. The clip ended in silence. But this time, the quiet didn't feel empty. It felt charged with recognition. Judge Keene stared at the screen for a long moment, his face unreadable, his lips pressed tightly shut. The courtroom waited, yet nobody seemed to look to him for direction anymore. Lorraine took one step forward. "This isn't justice," she said. "It's damage control." Her voice wasn't raised. It didn't need to be. It carried the force of truths long held back. She didn't look at the judge, nor at Mathers. Instead, she addressed the entire room. What you just witnessed wasn't a mistake. It was a system functioning exactly as it was designed to until someone refused to move. She didn't speak Amamira's name. She didn't have to. A ripple moved through the courtroom crowd. A woman near the back clutched her handbag, tighter, then slowly rose to her feet. A man followed her, then 2 more, then an entire row, then the whole galara quiet. Wordless, as if standing was the only way to process what they'd just seen. They weren't standing in protest. They were standing for truth. Amamira sat motionless. Her hands rested gently on her lap. The cuffs were gone, but the memory of their weight lingered in the room, and yet she no longer appeared small. She looked steady. Riley stepped back to her side, didn't say a word. He simply stood beside her, shoulder to shoulder. Amamira placed both feet firmly on the floor, her back straight, eyes unfocused on anyone in particular. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She didn't thank the crowd for finally seeing her. Because this moment wasn't about gratitude, it was about recognition. From behind the last bench, a phone rose into view. A young reporter, silent until then, leaned forward ever so slightly. His camera lifted, hidden, unapologetic. The light blinked red. The world was about to witness what this courtroom had tried to bury. Lorraine turned not to the judge, but to the people now standing shoulder to shoulder behind the benches. "It was never about who shouts the loudest," she said. "It's about who refuses to look away." No one sat back down in the judge. He sat motionless. Not in resistance, but in the dawning realization that whatever power he once held in that room had been quietly stripped away, not by force, but by truth. As Amamara stood, Riley took a small step to the side. She didn't raise her arms. She didn't wave. She simply walked past the defense table, slowly and silently, through the center of the courtroom into the glow of the hallway. And as she walked, the silence moved with her, because sometimes the loudest verdict is the one no one dares to say aloud. And in that moment, no one doubted who had won. When Amamara stepped into the sunlight, the world didn't erupt. There were no blinding camera flashes, no shouted questions, no roaring crowds. Only the quiet rhythm of her footsteps on stone and the gentle murmur of wind weaving between the courthouse columns. The doors creaked open behind her, but no one followed. No bailiff, no officer. Not even a backward glance from the judge. Lorraine walked beside her, steady and silent. Not leading, not shielding, simply there. They descended the courthouse steps without hesitation. No rush, no attempt to hide. If leaving that building was something they'd been ready to do long before anyone else realized the trial had already ended, a small crowd gathered, hushed and unsure. No one spoke immediately. They merely shifted to make space. Some stared, stunned into silence. Others looked down, uncertain of what to do with their hands or their eyes. The moment held balanced in fragile quiet. And then, through that hush, a voice emerged. It wasn't loud nor dramatic, just simple, honest. A little girl, no more than 10, standing beside her mother, her braids pulled tight, spoke. She didn't yell, and she still changed everything. A butterfly patch mended the shoulder of her jacket. When she spoke, there was no smile, just an intent gaze carrying the kind of wonder only children possess. The way they perceive truths adults aren't yet ready to acknowledge. Amamara shifted slightly, locking eyes with the girl, and offered a faint nod. That was all it took. From the crowd, a journalist cautiously stepped forward, lowering their microphone and speaking softly. "Why didn't you fight back?" Amira hesitated. Not because she lacked a response, but because she understood how much weight hung in that instant. She let the quiet expand and settle. And then, as though revealing a truth that didn't need volume to be heard, she said, "Because sometimes silence isn't fear, it's strategy." No applause followed. None was necessary. A gentle breeze stirred, carrying her words into the open air, and that was enough to set things in motion. Within an hour, a short video of her statement hit the internet. By midday, it had spread across timelines and screens not typically devoted to courtroom stories. Grandmothers shared it beneath family photos. Teachers scribbled it on classroom whiteboards. Activists painted it onto murals. Without any official press releases or public relations efforts, Mira's name began trending not as a fleeting moment of fame, but as acknowledgement. It wasn't about a single incident anymore. It was the recognition of a movement long underway, quiet, patient, now finally visible. Inside the courthouse, the change continued to ripple outward. Ada Eliza Mather slipped out through a side exit. Her hands were empty, her eyes lowered. She left without a statement, no closing arguments, no media address. And yet, the silence surrounding her departure felt more significant than anything she'd spoken in court. Within 2 days, her name vanished from the prosecutor's roster. Her resignation appeared as a short, unexplained note. But photos capturing her expression in the courtroom were already circulating widely online, in the judge's chambers. Roland Keene remained seated by himself, his gavel untouched, his bench stripped of its former authority. He lingered there long after the last voices faded from the building, as though he believed silence might somehow come to his defense. But it didn't, and by the following week, an official ethics investigation was underway, filed not by the CIA, nor by a defense attorney, but by his own court clerk, who had quietly witnessed every hearing from the sidelines. Meanwhile, Beckett and Harlow spent the night in separate holding cells. No badges, no belts, no media attention, and no special protection. Harlow tried to argue during processing. Beckett clenched his jaw and stayed silent, yet neither one truly resisted. Now, they too understood what silence could mean, and they realized that this time, silence meant nobody was coming to save them. In Lorraine's cozy living room, Mira curled up in the corner of the sofa, shoes off, legs tucked beneath her. The television was silent.
Oh no.
Social media, no endless scrolling, just stillness. Lorraine sat beside her, an arm draped along the back of the couch, not pulling Amira closer, but offering quiet solidarity. It was a sort of silence only shared by those who deeply understand one another. Outside, the noise continued to grow. Clips from the trial, photos of Amira standing calm and steady, replays of her measured voice responding to the question that seemed to echo endlessly. Why didn't you yell? And her answer kept resurfacing. Because silence isn't fear, strategy. Some people labeled her courageous. Others called her brilliant. But most people simply called her by her name. It's not defendant, not the girl from the video. Just Amira, the one who never shouted on, never needed to. It all began with a fleeting moment that many might have missed. A gentle, unforced smile, unposed and genuine, curving across Amira's lips as she stepped away from the courthouse. Her shoulders were relaxed, her gaze steady. The glimpse lasted barely a second. Yet someone captured it and someone else found words for it. This is what dignity looks like. By the next morning, the clip had reached over 6 million viewers. News anchors played it without commentary. Writers declared it the instant when the system blinked. One headline proclaimed, "The trial that ended with a whisper." Another simply read, "The girl who never had to yell." In the days afterward, public conversation grew louder around her, though it remained quiet within her. Commentators analyzed her words. Families began discussing topics they'd long kept silent, but Amira stayed still. She granted no interviews. She made no posts. She offered no further explanations. She'd already said everything she needed to say. 1 week later, she walked into her new school. Different corridors, new faces, no cameras, no security detail, no big entrance. Just a girl carrying a backpack, moving at a steady pace. Her hair was tied back, her sweater simple and unadorned. She navigated the hallway like any other student. But the atmosphere around her felt subtly different. Some students averted their eyes not out of discomfort but from quiet respect. Others held their gaze not with awe, but with a calm admiration that required no words. A girl by the window shifted her backpack off the seat beside her. Mariah sat down, no one spoke. She didn't smile. She didn't have to. Across the street, a battered car with peeling paint and a crooked rearview mirror, Lorraine sat behind the wheel. She hadn't followed her daughter inside. She promised she wouldn't. Yet she remained long enough to see. Amir vanished into the school hallway, and in that pause caught between stillness and movement, Lorraine finally let her shoulders ease for the first time in weeks. Her eyes softened, her fingers relaxed around the steering wheel, and a quiet sigh escaped her lips, like an invisible burden she no longer needed to carry. Downtown. On the courthouse lawn, someone planted a sign in the ground. Not made of stone or bronze, just a simple wooden stake painted white with a message in clean letters. Accountability begins here. Nobody claimed credit. Nobody needed to. Tourists snapped photos beside it. Teachers incorporated it into their lessons. Activists gathered near it during protests, holding silence as though it were its own language. The sign didn't shout. It simply stood like the girl whose courage had made it necessary. Then, a new video began circulating. No narration, no commentary. Just a soft piano score accompanying slow, deliberate images. Amira standing between the officer and the elderly man. Amamara sitting calmly with her wrists bound. Amamara watching the courtroom turn against itself. Amira walking out the courthouse doors, her head held high. Finally, the screen faded to black. Silent words appeared, to every girl told to sit down. You were always meant to rise. People shared the video without adding any captions. It didn't need explanations. Mothers forwarded it to daughters. Teachers played it at the start of class. A librarian printed the final words and pinned them beneath a shelf of biographies. Right below the names of women whose voices had once been drowned out, and somewhere far from any courthouse or camera lens. A girl sat alone in her bedroom reading. As daylight dwindled, she had heard time and again that her voice was too soft, that her quiet nature made her invisible. But as she replayed the video, her hands stopped trembling at the thought of being silent, because maybe silence wasn't what people had always claimed. Maybe it wasn't the absence of power, but the place where power begins. Perhaps silence was the space between fear and certainty, the realm where restraint exists, not because it's forced upon you, but because you choose it. And maybe real strength isn't always the loudest sound in the room. Sometimes it's the only presence that doesn't have to raise its voice. If this story stirred something within you, let yourself pause and absorb it. Because what unfolded in that courtroom was about more than legal proceedings or punishment. It was about dignity and the quiet resilience that lives inside people who've been told they don't matter, yet show up anyway. It was the story of a girl who never had to shout to make the world stop and listen. If you believe in stories like this, stories that speak even when others fall silent, stories that remind us who we are and what we're capable, tap the like button. Share this video with someone who needs to remember that strength doesn't always roar. And if you haven't yet, subscribe to Mr. Max Stories. Here, we don't just tell stories, we preserve what silence remembers. Your support fuels our ability to keep uncovering powerful, human-centered narratives that deserve to be heard. Every like, comment, and share helps us amplify the next voice waiting to be discovered. Thank you for being part of this journey.